All right, so I wanted to cover today how exercise can help regulate your appetite. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover research on levels of physical activity and its impact on hunger, and then also how much we eat. So, I'm going to cover some research that suggests that physical activity is an important regulator of appetite. Appetite being the totality of the processes that influence how much we eat. It's going to include things like hunger sensations, fullness, the desire to eat, food selection, food hedonics, and then also satiety. So, how full do we actually feel? And I wanted to start out by just covering some background research, and this research actually took place in the 1950s. So this Jean Mayer, he was a French-American scientist, best known for his research on the physiological basis for hunger. So in the 1950s, Mayer demonstrated that there was a relationship between occupational physical activity and daily energy intake, and this was in Bengali mill workers. So again, this was in the 1950s. So these workers had occupations that ranged from sedentary to very heavy work. So sedentary jobs were things like shopkeepers, supervisors, and clerks. And then the most active people were blacksmiths, coal workers, bale carriers, things like that. So a spread of being inactive to very active. So those who were performing very heavy work consumed more than those who were performing light work. That makes sense. Your job, you expend more calories, you need more to take in more calories. So again, the more calories that you expend, the more that you need to take in for energy balance. Now, in the workers with higher levels of occupational physical activity, what they ate and what they expended was closely matched, okay? So they were not at risk for weight gain. But at low levels of occupational physical activity where body mass also is greater, so those sedentary individuals had higher body masses, the coupling between energy intake and energy output was lost, which again, this is something that leads to weight gain. So their daily energy intake exceeded energy expenditure for the people that were performing sedentary or light work. And so Mayer, in this case, first observed that this uncoupling of energy expenditure and energy intake, or the inability to achieve energy balance, which will lead to weight gain eventually. So what I will do next, again, this is just a little bit of background. What I'll do next is cover energy balance and then discuss some of the research that looks specifically at exercise as a regulator of appetite. So energy balance, what is that? Energy balance and the resulting effects on body weight are going to be the product of the relationship between energy intake and energy expenditure, okay? Energy intake is basically just driven by appetite. It's how much we eat. It gets synonymous with the calories that you take in. Energy expenditure is going to be a little bit different. So energy intake, again, is going to be influenced by internal biological factors, such as your resting metabolic rate, or this is also known as what the body burns at rest, and also external nutritional factors, which can include like the energy density of the food. So if my resting metabolic rate is higher, I'm going to be more likely to consume more food. And also, if the food that I'm eating has high energy density, I'm probably going to be consuming more calories. So that's energy intake. Energy expenditure is composed of your resting metabolic rate, which I just discussed, physical activity energy expenditure, and then also something that's called the thermic effect of food. Your resting metabolic rate accounts for about 60 to 70% of your energy output, so the energy expenditure. Physical activity is about 15 to 35%. There's a huge variation for this. So for example, I read some anywhere in between 4% to 40%. But in this case, I think it's safe to say 15 to 35% for just physical activity. And then 5 to 15% for the thermic effect of food, or the energy needed to digest food. Again, there's pretty large variance in the calories people expend through physical activity. So physical activity includes structured exercise, okay, as well as occupational, household, and then also transportation related physical activity. This is termed non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT. Now, appetite is going to be controlled by several processes that signal hunger, satiation, and satiety. Satiety is the suppression of hunger, which in turn determine food intake. Now, appetite signals are going to be either episodic or also tonic. So those are two different types of appetite signals. Episodic signals are the body's response to the food that we eat, that are involved in the meal-to-meal regulation of appetite. These signals regulate our eating behavior by making us stop eating, and they also prevent us from overeating. And you could think of them as also satiety signals. There are different types of signals involved in ending a meal. This is called satiation, and preventing further eating, which is post-meal satiety. When we eat, our brain receives information about the amount of food we've eaten and its nutrients through our senses. So the gastrointestinal tract has special receptors that monitor the body's physiological activity and send information to the brain. This is usually mainly through the vagus nerve. This information is one type of satiety signal and in part of the control of appetite before the nutrients that we take in are actually absorbed. Now, after digestion, when nutrients have been broken down and entered into the bloodstream, this can be used by the body's tissues and organs for energy. They can directly these senses can directly reach the brain through the circulation and blood flow. Now, these nutrients and energy flow into the bloodstream, and they serve as another type of satiety signal related to metabolism. The products of digestion and the substances responsible for metabolizing them can reach the brain and affect specific receptors, neurotransmitters, or neuronal metabolism. In each of the cases, the brain receives information about the body's metabolic state after eating, and it's believed that chemicals are released by the stomach and the gastrointestinal tract during food processing play a role in controlling appetite. So specific hormones released after a meal include things like glucagon-like peptide 1, which is what we specifically work with at Sequence. It's medication, and this acts as a satiety signal and helps regulate meal termination. That's episodic signaling for hunger. Tonic signals are more long-term. So tonic signals of appetite are long-term regulators that help maintain our body's overall energy balance and control our feelings of hunger and fullness over longer periods of time. Now, these energy signals are more stable and consistent compared to other signals. They essentially set a baseline level of appetite and affect how much we feel like eating. Some examples of these tonic signals are hormones that include things like leptin, insulin, and ghrelin. These things play a crucial role in regulating long-term appetite. For example, leptin produced by fat cells signals satiety to the brain, while ghrelin, which is released by the stomach, stimulates hunger. And we already talked about GLP-1, how that helps with satiety as well. Now, these specific signals, when they're coupled with an environment that promotes obesity, like the one that we live in, it's called an obesogenic environment, they can put people who are vulnerable to over-consuming food in a difficult position. But there is some research on how physical activity can help with appetite control and regulation. So it might actually help with both sides of the equation, energy intake, and then also energy expenditure. And I think that this is important too, because physical activity is a relatively easily modifiable factor, as in it's easy to change. Easy to change short term, might be a lot more challenging to change long term. So in principle, physical activity can influence both of these signals, that tonic and episodic signals for appetite, by adjusting biological components of fat-free mass, fat mass, resting metabolic rate, and then basically after we eat, so post-nutritional peptides. In addition, physical activity will influence appetite through both direct and indirect mechanisms. The direct effect of physical activity on energy expenditure it tends to increase appetite because of the increase in total energy expenditure. But the point here is how physical activity can help people regulate their energy balance. So what they eat is not necessarily equal to what they expend, okay? So when we exercise, and I guess I'll specifically talk about when we exercise chronically, and I'll talk about the difference between chronic and acute exercise. This can actually improve some hormones. So for example, it can increase the amount of GLP-1 released after a meal, which again can enhance our feelings of fullness, which means people that are chronically physically active may be able to improve the signals in their body that make them feel satisfied, and then can also prevent overeating. So what I'm going to do now is I want to discuss the role of physical activity and how it can help with appetite regulation, okay? So, but first, physical activity and exercise is going to be multifaceted. There are many different ways to be active, and there is also a distinction between acute and chronic exercise. I'll predominantly be talking about chronic exercise in this review, as well as exercise's interaction with individual traits like sex, age, body weight. So there's a lot of different ways that you can study the question of how does physical activity influence appetite. For example, you could look at somebody's habitual levels of physical activity and see how that's related to appetite. That was essentially what that first study that I was talking about looked at. So how physically active are you in your job? How does that relate to your appetite? Or you could do a trial where you introduce exercise to somebody that was sedentary and see how that changes their appetite. So we'll actually talk a little bit about both of those things. And also note that it's going to be the case that individuals will respond differently to the same stimulus. And exercise in this case, some people might respond really well to exercise, others might be more low responders to exercise. And this is all to say that while I will present the case that exercise probably is beneficial for appetite regulation, it's always challenging to make hard and firm conclusions. It's important to look at what works for whom, and then maybe specifically under what circumstances. With that, all that being said, let's be clear. Exercise is not necessarily going to be the best vehicle for weight loss. It does have a net positive impact on energy balance, as people that engage in, I'll specifically talk about aerobic exercise, do tend to lose about 2 to 3 kilograms of weight. This is, independent of dietary changes. So on the whole, if you are losing weight, you're experiencing a net caloric deficit. So that's saying that exercise probably does have a positive role on appetite regulation if people are able to lose weight. Also, it helps with weight loss maintenance. So again, that puts people back in this zone of regulation where what they are eating is equal to what they're taking in. So let's look at the actual scientific research on physical activity and appetite regulation. I'll start out with the 2016 study, and this was conducted by Robin Shook from the University of Iowa. So this research team investigated the relationship between energy intake, physical activity, and body weight in young adults. And this study was conducted over a 12-month period. Now, these researchers had a little bit more than 420 participants. And what they did is they looked at their habitual physical activity and they put them into quintiles. So there's 5 different groups of people. With the most active group, they were engaged in about 175 minutes of physical activity. That was moderate to vigorous in nature. And the least active group performed about, on average, 16 minutes of physical activity. Now, interestingly, the study found that the lowest physical activity group consumed more calories than the next 2 higher activity groups, and they were even close to consuming the same amount of calories as the 4th highest group. So participants with the lowest physical activity, interestingly enough, had stronger cravings for foods like, they were asked, what do you have food cravings for? They had stronger cravings for French fries, burgers, pizza, compared to those in the highest activity group. Now, this study did not find a difference in calculated energy intake based on the physical activity group. Now, in this case, though, one would expect the least active should be consuming the least amount of calories if energy intake and energy expenditure were well regulated. And while there was a trend for people that were more physically active to consume more calories, this was not true for the most sedentary group. So the most sedentary group was not eating as they would be expected to eat if they were in a good energy balance, okay? They were eating more than what they were expending, which eventually led to weight gain in that group. So now this study focused on habitual activity patterns, but what we can also do is explore the introduction of exercise to individuals. So what happens when we introduce exercise to individuals? So what I'll do is I'm going to cover this hypothesis that when energy expenditure through exercise is matched with energy intake, that means that's a signal that appetite control is improved. So in other words, if a person with overweight or obesity starts exercising and their calorie intake is lower than the new level of energy expenditure, it indicates better appetite regulation. So to get further into this topic, I'm going to cover a 2021 systematic review and meta-analysis titled Effective Exercise Training Interventions on Energy Intake and Appetite Control in Adults with Overweight or Obesity. Meta-analysis is a statistical analysis of all of the research on a certain topic. A systematic review is really just a synthesis of all the research within a certain topic. So this review investigated the effects of deliberate or introduced exercise regimens on energy intake in individuals with overweight or obesity. So again, they looked at many different studies, and within all of the studies that they looked at, The median prescription, so the just the most common exercise prescription, was of 45 minutes. The range of the exercise prescription in all of these studies was 30 to 111 minutes. Or in some of these studies, they reported how many calories they burned through exercise, which was, again, the median was 500 calories per session. The range was 233 to 600 calories per session. And the median in all of these studies, the median training frequency was 5 days per week, with a range of 2 to 7 days per week. Now, what they found was that exercise interventions had negligible impacts on energy intake. Again, that might sound like there's no results, but that's good, because the calories that they're expending through exercise increased. They're higher, on average 500 higher, but what they ate did not necessarily change. So that puts them at more of a deficit, or if not in a deficit, in a more regulated position. Now, in this study, the most rigorous way to assess caloric intake is through something called doubly labeled water. And using this technique, what they were able to see is that participants on average did, when exercise was introduced, increase the calories that they took in per day by about 100 calories. But again, on average, they were burning 500 calories per session. So that's a net negative of 400 calories. So these exercise interventions, they had minimal impacts on energy intake, which indicates that exercise alone did not induce significant changes in food intake or appetite. So again, this is good news. Introducing exercise can help people regulate their appetite and create a negative calorie balance, or again, a more regulated appetite. So in this case, what is likely happening here? And I'm going to take something, this is from a review that was titled Acute and Chronic Effects of Exercise on Appetite, Energy Intake, and Appetite-Related Hormones. So in this review, the authors state that physiological sensitivity to high energy preloads may be improved after exercise training. Okay, so what does this mean? After chronically exercising, in research, people are given different types of meals. We can say one that's highly caloric and maybe one that's not highly caloric. Later, they're able to eat whatever they want. People who exercise are better able to regulate their appetite so they do not overeat later if they already had a big meal. Again, these people might eat the same as people who are sedentary, but they had just burned something like 300 calories. So meaning that if both groups ate 900 calories, the sedentary group would have netted 900 calories, whereas an active group would have only netted 600 calories. And I think this is also well stated in a paper that was published in the journal Appetite, which was titled The Complex Pattern of the Effects of Prolonged Frequent Exercise on Appetite Control and Implications for Obesity. In this case, the authors state that individuals with greater physical activity behavior reduced energy intake to offset differences in energy consumed from the preloads, which is where they eat a high calorie meal, whereas individuals with lower physical activity behavior were insensitive to the nutritional manipulation, indicating a weaker satiety response to food. So in conclusion, it would seem that exercise can help with appetite regulation. This is evidenced by the fact that changes in eating behavior after exercise are no different than being sedentary. So the calories burned through exercise should help to create energy balance that is closer to energy output.